In the 30s, I had the opportunity to go up in a plane. I went to school at Laureley, and most of those schools had an old Waterbury furnace, and it needed some repair. So one Saturday afternoon, the repairman from Waterbury rented a plane, and the plane landed out in a stubble field near Laureley. And then while the furnace was being repaired, the pilot was taking people up in a flight. He was charging $5, of course. $5 bills were pretty scarce then, and I didn't have $5, so I asked my dad if he could spare $5. He said no. He said, I don't have $5, but there was a red and white store there, and a fellow by the name of Harry Town. And he said, well, if I loan you $5, can you pay me back? And I said, well, I got a little trap line, and I got some weasels. How many have you got? I said, well, I got about 5 now. He said, what do you think you can get for them? And I said, well, 2 of them are pretty good size. I might be able to get about $8 or $9 for my ship. And he said, okay, here's $5. He said, so when you sell your weasel skins, he said, you go. But I'll never forget that. It was in January, and it was a cold day in an open cockpit, and I damn near froze. But that's when I first got my first desire to fly. We were about 25 miles west of Melville. So the way the crow flies, it would probably be about 60 miles from Yorkton. In late 1940, they opened the service flying station at Yorkton, and they were flying Harvards. So, of course, there was always Harvards flying over the farm, doing aerobatics and so on. Of course, that time we didn't have a tractor. We didn't have a car. So I took my grade 9 and 10 by correspondence, so I stayed on the farm for about a year helping my dad, driving these horses. And it soon got whenever Harvard would come over doing their barracks, I'd stop the horses and watch them. And it got to the point where I didn't have to tell them to woo, they would actually automatically stop. So I spent several hours watching them. That's where I really got the bug to fly. But in order to be a pilot, you had to have your grade 12. So in the fall of 41, they were getting short of bomber pilots in Britain. So they opened what they call pre-enlistment schools. So if you passed a medical and an aptitude test, then you could enroll in this pre-enlistment school. And if you were accepted, then you were still in civics, but you got paid by the Air Force. In Canada, they had the British come with their training plan here because the land, there was lots of land to build aerodromes, and the weather was conducive for flying, and all the towns were lit up, your aircraft were lit up. When you got overseas, everything was blacked out. All the houses were blacked out. The only time you could see the aerodrome on the flare path is when you got lined up with the runway, because they were all hooded. And there were thousands killed in England, and basically one of the reasons was the conditions were so much more difficult. And the weather was bad thing too. There was a lot of cloud. And most pilots going into Bomber Command, they went on what they called a BAT course, a beam approach training, for 8 to 10 weeks. And you did mostly instrument flying. That was to prepare you for operations, because lots of times you'd be flying at night. You have no navigation lights. Your cockpit lights were dimmed. And of course you'd be flying in cloud, and there were numerous collisions. You can imagine whether it be 600-800 aircraft or 1,000 aircraft on a raid. They had to be over the target within a space of half an hour. The aircraft would be close together, and if they were evading a night fighter attack, of course, you'd be at right angles, doing your corkscrew, and there were hundreds of collisions, and not too many survived those. And all the planes were camouflaged too, to blend in with the countryside. That was another thing too, because sometimes you'd be coming into land and you could almost land on another plane without realizing it was there. 5 crews went to the squadron the day that I arrived. We were there about 4 or 5 days, and then all the pilots go on what they call the second dicky trip. So I went with a flying officer, Philbin, and we went to Amiens, which was a V-2 bombing site at a railway junction we were bombing. It was as far as I was concerned, we didn't get attacked by night fighters, and I went for experience. So when we came back and were coming into land, I was standing behind him. And he saw me and he told me to go back to the crash position, which is by the main spar. Well, I didn't go. I just stepped back a little bit so he couldn't see me. And we landed, and then, unbeknownst to the crew, they had a 500-pound bomb hung up. Although the bombing switch was off, the bomb was still live. And I'm standing behind the pilot. The next thing I know, I'm lying on the runway. When the bomb dropped off and hit the runway, it exploded. And it cut the aircraft, blew the back part of the aircraft away, killed the 2 gunners, and the wings and that were, and the motors were sitting on the thing. And then, of course, I thought I was bleeding to death. I felt well wet, and of course, what was happening, all the gas lines were punctured. So I picked myself up, and I suppose you're in shock. We never heard the bomb. And it woke up all the personnel on the station. Blew a big hole in the runway, so that was my initiation. I had a phosphorus burn on my arm, and I think what happened, they don't know how. My battle dress wasn't burned, but I had this phosphorus burn on my arm, but they didn't know at the time at the station. They sent me on leave, and it just looked like a scrape. But then it turned out that I got gangrene in it, so then they sent me to Basingstoke, which was a big army hospital in the First World War. Well, they were so busy with tank cars, they couldn't look after me. I ended up at East Grinstead. So then I was there for about 3.5 months. So when I got back to the squadron, I figured, well, my crew will have another pilot, but I suppose they kept thinking I'd be back any day. And so when I got back, they were still there waiting for me. So then we did a couple of orientation trips, and we went back on ops. And on our 13th trip, the lorry was taking us out to the aircraft, and it was raining. We'd been scrubbed about 3 times, and finally about midnight we told to take off. And I noticed my rear gunner was very quiet, and I said to him, "Well, Kenny, do you not feel well?" He said, "Well, Skipper, do you know what trip this is?" And I said, "Yeah, it's number 13. He said, "Do you mind if we call it 12A?" I said, "Why?" He said, "I don't like 13. It's not a good number." And I said, "Sure." I said, "We'll call it 12A, Kenny." Well, I often wonder if he had a premonition, because just when we got the okay to go, I was the 5th aircraft off. And I'm barely down the runway. The runways aren't very long in those bomber stations. And I'm 3/4 of the way down the runway. There was a terrible bang, and I lost all power in the starboard inner. Of course, as soon as that happens, you got the other engines full bore, so the aircraft swerved off the runway. And it's pitch black, there's no lights, and I knew that the other aircraft were still in the marshalling track. So I knew I might crash into them. I didn't know if I could stop, so I shoved the throttles through the gate. You got extra power. Well, when you do that, these 2 engines were full bore, and the aircraft just went like this, so I knew we were going to go in. So I straightened it out. I remember yelling to the crew to brace themselves. We're going in, and I don't remember anymore. I got over the aircraft that were loaded with bombs, and about 1/4 mile off the drome, we crashed into a big stone wall surrounding a farmhouse. And fortunately, our bomb load that night had delayed fuses on them. And the bombs didn't explode when we actually crashed, but I don't remember the crash. My bomb aimer he didn't die immediately, but he died on the way to the hospital. When we hit, he went forward into the instrument panel, and one of the things went into his forehead, and he got a severe brain damage, so he died on the operating table. And I came to probably half an hour later, and I guess some of the crew pulled me out of the wreck. I don't remember. We went on leave for about 10 days. I had a broken nose and stitches in my face. We went back flying, And on the 17th trip, my wireless operator, I don't know whether he went to sleep, but he missed a diversion. So I came all the way back to Crofton. I was the only aircraft in 6th Group that came back. So I didn't have too much fuel left, and they told me to stand by. And finally they said, well, the only drome open is at Sylhet on the west coast on the RBC. Well, I knew I'd never get there. So I thought, well, I can't bail out where there's still some fuel in, so I waited till one engine quit, and then I gave orders for the crew to bail out. We were still flying in cloud and rain. They all bailed out, and it was an experience for me because being the pilot, you have to be the last to bail out. So by this time, the second engine had quit, and I was losing height, and I'm not very tall, but I remember reaching up to get out of the seat because the Halifax had 3 levers, the one for the bomb doors, one for the undercarriage, and one for the flaps. So they come up like this. So I slid over, figured I was clear, and I let myself go, and the lever caught between my harness and my leg, and I was dangling there. And I don't know how to this day. I remember thrashing around because I couldn't reach back up. And finally something gave way, and I went tumbling down the 3 steps where you bail out the front end. And then I hit my elbow, fell out there, and I found my parachute ring. I pulled the thing. I remember seeing the tail of the aircraft go by. I pulled it. Nothing happened. I thought, oh, it's not going to open. And finally it opened, and I really have no sensation of falling in a parachute. I just went like this. I came back and I hit the ground, so I probably bailed out about 600 or 700 feet. My 2 gunners and I finally got together by blowing our whistles after the fog cleared. We walked all day and never saw a soul. 7 o'clock at night, we came across a shepherd and his wife. They were tending sheep. They had a summer home with a mud floor and bacon eggs from the ceiling, so they made us bacon and eggs, and then an RAF lorry came, picked us up, took us to Penrith, and the rest of my crew were there. So when we got back to the station, the medical officer, commanding officer said, well, we better send this crew to London to the Central Medical Board and get their nerves checked out. So we went to London, spent 3 days there. Being from the farm, I didn't know there was such a thing as psychiatrists and psychologists, but I soon discovered that they existed. And the end result was when we got back to the station, they called me in, and the commanding officer and the medical officer were there, and they said, well, the medical board have determined that your crew, they're not fit to fly anymore. They can't do an adequate job. So although they've only done 17 trips, we're going to give them credit for a tour. But if you and your rear gunner want to fly, you're still fit to fly. But if you want to go back to Canada, you can do so. So I got hold of Kenny, my rear gunner, and I told him what the story was. And I remember Kenny saying to me, well, Skipper, if the rest of the squadron know that we're fit to fly and we don't fly, they'll think we're cowards. I said, boy, Kenny, we wouldn't want to think that. We better get another crew. Well, at that time, there were lots of odds and sods, you know, that they might have been in sick bay. For some reason, their crew went on ops. The crew never came back. So they finally got another crew for me. So I remember the navigator came to me. His name was Pappy Edwards. He was a good friend of my navigator's. And he said, Crash, can I finish my tour with you? I've only got 3 trips to do. Well, I said, you know what my record is, Pappy? Oh, he said, I know you can fly. Those weren't your fault. He said, I'd like to fly with you. So by that time, the 41 was converted to Canadian Lancs. They were built in Montreal. Beautiful aircraft. So we had about 4 or 5 hours sitting in the cockpits in different positions, and then we went on short cross country, did some air-to-sea firing, and then we went on ops. And the first trip that we did on ops, of course, my luck, we got diverted. Couldn't get back to base, and we had to land on Fido. Now, Fido, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but when a station is fogged in, they have these 2 gas lines on either side of the runway, and they pump high-octane gas through them. It's got holes in these pipes, and they set fire to it. And the heat from this gasoline disperses the fog up to about 500 feet. But in order to get on the runway, you have to use your Morse code. And I used that when I was doing my beam approach training, and it was a year and a half later that I had to use it. And I'd forgotten which was right and which was left, and I was in the circuit for about 15 minutes before I got it figured out. But I finally got it figured out, and I got lined up with the runway, and I looked at my altimeter, and I was still 1,000 feet, 800 feet, and they're still in fog. And then about 600 feet, you break through the fog, and there's two walls of fire. So you think, well, boy, you better keep this aircraft between these two walls. So that was my first trip in a Lancaster. And it was a big American drone at Tuddenham. So then we had a breakfast there, a beautiful breakfast and a beautiful mess. We went back to our base and were there 2 days, and we went to Duisburg in the Ruhr. That had been bombed numerous times. We were on the bombing run, and I had a new crew. I heard a lot of noise, and the rear gunner yelled at me, and he said, "Skipper, there's a Halifax shooting at us." I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yeah, I can see him. He's shooting at, what'll I do?" Well, I said, if it's a Halifax, I said, maybe we should shoot back. Well, about that time, the shooting had stopped, but we got hit with flak, and one engine caught fire. But my engineer got that up. We're on the bombing run. Dropped the bombs, went to close the bomb doors, and we only got them partly closed. Got back to base, went to put the wheels down, and I only got one wheel. I didn't realize at the time, but when this Halifax shot at us, all the hydraulic lines were down the port side, and they punctured the hydraulic lines. So the engineer tried to get the wheel down with the crank, and it wouldn't work. Then we had a bottle of 1,200 pounds pressure. It wouldn't come down. So they told me to stand by. Finally, they said, you'll have to go to a crash drone. They're 3 miles long of tarmac, and then a mile of grass at the end, and they've got 3 flare paths. If you're not in dire emergency, you got a green. If you go out to say one wheel, they put me in the middle with the amber, and then if you're in dire emergency, you got red. So I'm in the middle. And I thought, well, I'm but I'm in the North Sea. I'm turning in from the North Sea. One engine had quit. So I thought, well, I better come in fairly high, and I came in high, and I came in fairly fast. I never landed on one wheel before. Anyway, as soon as the aircraft touched down, I guess there was too much wing, and the oleo leg snapped off, and then I ground looped about 4 times, and I went right across all the flare paths, and I ended up on the grass. And they were so organized there. The crash trucks and the fire engines, they were following that aircraft when it was ground looping. As soon as it stopped, they were on top of there. They chopped open the cockpit, chopped off my harness, pulled me out of there within about 10 seconds. When the commanding officer called me in, and he said, well, Crash, he said, you've survived 4 of them. He said, I got a feeling you're not going to survive the next one. He said, so I'm going to screen you. You've got 19 trips, but you're going to give you your ops wing. And he said, if you want to stay here, he said, you can stay here because now most of Europe are occupied. This would be in late December of 44. Early January, he said, we're flying a lot of supplies over to the continent. So if you want to stay here, he said, you can do that. Or he said, you can go back to Canada. So I gave it some thought, and I spoke to Kenny, and he said, oh, well, he said, I'd like to start farming again. Maybe we better go back to Canada. So in January, we went back to Canada. War changes thousands and thousands of lives. One of my close buddies in the Air Force, there's pictures there, his name was Buddy Holloway. And I met Buddy when we did that pre-enlistment course, and he was from Ottawa, and he was engaged to Gene Woods. And he was real tall, good-looking guy, and called me Harry. And it just seemed that whenever we went, we got posted together. And when I went on harvest leave, he went to Regina IT Initial Training School on Tiger Moss. And of course, I couldn't go. I had to go to the farm for 6 weeks. So then I went to Verdun. I did mine, and then I got posted to Yorkton. And when I got to Yorkton here, Buddy's there, and that was a bad winter, 42, 43, lots of storms. And they were just going to start their course, so I started the same course as Buddy. We got our wings together, we got our commissions, went overseas together, and every time he would write to Gene, he'd say, "Okay, Harry, put a footnote on this letter to Gene." And I'd always say, "Well, I don't know, Gene." And he'd always say, "You never know. Someday you might meet her." Well, poor old Buddy. We were at Bournemouth. We went to that beam approach training course together. I have a picture of the last day we were there. We had a little bat woman, a Welsh gal. We were sitting there. Somebody took our picture. Went back to Bournemouth. I got posted to Ossington, and he went to a different OTU. And then I found out later when he was doing his last cross country at Conversion, they were coming into land, and they had to cross the Great Northern Railway. He was at Skipton, and the engineer absentmindedly switched the engines over to another full tank. Of course, the aircraft lost altitude, and he crashed into the Great Northern Railway, and there were only 3 of them survived, and he was killed. So I remember writing to Gene and said, "Well, if I survive this war, I'll promise you." So to make a long story short, when I got to Ottawa in early January, it was a Saturday, we landed at Lachine, and I phoned and already wired my folks at Melville and told them when I'd be there. I wasn't going to stop. So I phoned, and Jean wasn't there. Her sister, Ange, was there, and she said, "Oh, when will you be arriving in Ottawa?" And I said, "Well, I don't think I will have time." Angie said, "Oh, Jean's going to be so disappointed. She wanted to talk to you about Buddy." I said, "Well, I'm sorry," I said, "but I already wired my folks." I hung up the phone, and then some little voice said to me, "You know, that's pretty selfish of you. You survived 4 plane crashes. You're still here. Poor old Buddy, he gets killed in his first crash. So the least you can do is go and see her." So I phoned back, maybe 3 hours later, and Jean was home. And she said, "Oh, Anne said you weren't going to be able to stop." And I said, "Well, Jean, I've changed my mind. I am going to stop." She said, "When will you be here?" I said, "Well, I don't really know." I said, "There's hundreds of airmen here. They'll have to fill up a troop train." So eventually, after about 3 days, they got the train full. We landed at the Union Station. It's a beautiful station, big marble pillars. I had my kit bag and I brought my flying boots back with him. So my uncle gave me a little leather bag for putting my flying boots in, and I remember sitting on my kit bag because I didn't know anybody there, and everybody's greeting everybody. And finally, the crowd thinned out, and I looked across, and I saw 2 women standing there looking at a picture. Oh, maybe they're looking for me. So I remember getting my kit bag, and it was cold. I had my gray coat on and my uniform, and I dragged it over there, and I stopped, and I said, "Are you ladies looking for someone?" They said, "Yeah, we're looking for a Flight Lieutenant Harrison." "Oh," I said, "I'm a flight lieutenant. Maybe you're looking for me." Well, that's how I met Jean, and I was going to stay 2 days, and I stayed a week. And I only saw her I went back to the farm. I went down there for 10 days. I went back, and I started working for the Veterans Land Administration in November. In 46, I only got a week's leave. I went down there for a week, and in December 23rd, 46, we were married. Raised 3 daughters. So I often wondered if poor old Buddy had a premonition that he wasn't going to make it. Every time he would say the same thing: "You never know. Someday you might meet her." My girls often said, "Dad, I'm sure glad you put those footnotes on there. We wouldn't be here."